Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak in front of you today. My name is Matthew Kenney. I'm a researcher at Duke University in computational media. So looking at kind of like the intersection of society and technology. And today I wanted to talk about creative red teaming as an approach to addressing bias and misuse in machine learning. And I'm posing this as a kind of proposition or a framework to tackle these issues. So the first question that we should ask is, what is red teaming? What is the concept of red teaming? Red teaming is a practice of rigorously challenging plans, policies, and systems and assumptions by adopting an adversarial approach, right? So we want to design an attack simulation to see how well organizations can withstand an attack from a real-life adversary. And we'll take this approach by kind of like a traditional data analysis approach. We'll start out with some exploratory analysis. We'll move into a kind of a model development and then a little bit of model analysis as well. And for this case study, and again, I'm going to kind of like pare back this case study as a very kind of like simple and kind of like straightforward study. But we'll be looking at the Russian IRA, the Internet Research Agency, who, if you're from America and have been paying attention to the news, certainly attacked our election throughout 2016. And a little bit of background before we start diving into this data. The IRA generally produced human-generated content. They produced it across major social media platforms, Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, etc., as well as self-hosted websites. One thing to pay attention to is that their budget was around a little bit over $25 million US, and their operational budget was $1.25 million a month. So a pretty substantial amount of money to be spending on this disinformation campaign. The database that we'll be using, again, for this case study, relatively straightforward. It's a Twitter election integrity database. And that's composed of tweets that were taken down from Twitter in direct relation to IRA activity, right? So there were almost close to 9 million tweets, almost close to 3 million English tweets across 3,600 users. And before we dive into this data and take a look at this kind of case study, we should talk about the kind of like terms around fake information or false information, right? So disinformation is the kind of like false information that's spread with the intent to deceive. So what we might think of as fake news, kind of like fake reports. Malinformation is a strategic dissemination of true facts with a negative intent. And both of those were, the disinformation and malinformation were used by the IRA in their approach to spreading disinformation. And misinformation is incorrect or information that was spread without the intent to harm. So we could think of that as, maybe people unwittingly kind of like liking or sharing or retweeting, kind of like fake tweets, right? Kind of like false information, whether it be malinformation or disinformation. So let's dive into this case study with a little bit of exploratory analysis and research how we might develop this attack. The first question that we should ask were, who are the targets of this disinformation campaign? And if we take a look at some of the prior research, particularly this graph from Tactics and Tropes of the Internet Research Agency by New Knowledge, which was put out relatively recently, we see that Black Twitter was attacked, particularly the Black Lives Matter and police brutality movement. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with Black Twitter. It's a place that's kind of like near and dear to my heart. It's this kind of like sacred space that we've carved out online. And to see, kind of like witness it be attacked was something that really kind of like struck me, and one of the main reasons that I dived into this research. So we can see, across YouTube content, 96% of the content was focused around mal or disinformation on Black Lives Matters and police brutality. It was across 59% of the channels. If we look at the ads that were placed as well, we can see the number of ads targeting African-American politics and culture, as well as Black identity. The user impressions are well beyond kind of like the rest of the section, as well as kind of like the number of ads and the amount spent. And we can see the third one down is geared towards conservative politics and culture. So really using this as kind of like a wedge point to drive this disinformation campaign and divide people. So that's great. We have a kind of like a background and history of kind of like a broad spectrum of what's happening, but we should take a look at some of these profiles ourselves to see what is really happening within this data. And one thing that we can do is take all of the images, all of the profile pictures, and represent it as a kind of like T-SNE visualization. So run it through a convolutional neural network, get a kind of like high-dimensional vector representation, and then bring that representation down into a T-SNE plot. And one of the things that we find is that there are these kind of like groups and clusters of people, right? Like on the left, we see, like a group of kind of like women, maybe like 25 to 30. In the upper right, we see, kind of like a bunch of men in suits. And one of the other clusters that really stuck out to me in this representation is these kind of like news outlets, right? There's kind of like cluster of like logos and graphics. And if we look particularly closely at these, we see a ton of kind of both traditional news sources. So we can see some profile pictures of traditional news sources from maybe like St. Louis or Albuquerque. But we also see a lot of kind of like Black culture iconography, right? If you look, you see the kind of like outline of the United States with a BM, a gun with "Don't Shoot," a kind of like a couple of Blacktivist logos, along with the kind of like more traditional news sources that we might find. And what we find is that they were creating these fake anti-police brutality organizations, right? And kind of like appropriating that iconography for their own uses. They were also, again, creating traditional news sources. And we can see that these traditional news sources are mainly clustered around cities where they were kind of like points of contention, right? St. Louis, for instance, might be one of them. Oakland and Philadelphia might be another, where there were kind of protests and this kind of movement that was building. Interestingly, if we look at the banners, the kind of like Twitter banners, right, that you post along with your profile picture and plot these, we see some kind of similar, like very interesting patterns. One is what I might call generics. They're kind of like boats and landscapes and sunsets. And if we take a really close look at them, they're really kind of like stock photos, right? Like something maybe you would like find on like your grandmother's laptop or something, but not something that you would like find on your kind of like friend's profile picture. So I found that particularly interesting, and if we were kind of like blue teaming this or defending against this attack, that might be something that we might want to look at. Additionally, we see a lot of kind of like patriotic insignia, kind of like American flags, et cetera. And we see a striking amount of people in these background profiles as well. And that may be, I could like venture a guess that maybe they're like trying to like humanize these people or kind of like, develop a narrative around them that kind of goes beyond the regular profile picture, right? If you were to like, again, kind of like look at your friends' Twitter banners, you wouldn't see like a ton of groups of people kind of like hanging out in the background, I would venture to guess. And again, we find that they were kind of appropriating Black culture through the use of these Twitter banners as well. If we took a look at the tweets themselves, the most popular ones, again, are focused on kind of like Black culture, many of them positive, some of them negative as well. And if we look at the timeline, and this is just a timeline in 2016 from June and July, but if we were, also to look at the timeline from maybe like 15 to 17, we see these massive spikes, right? So these accounts laid relatively dormant for the most part, maybe a couple of tweets here and there, 5 or 10 tweets. And then we see this massive spike, and this one is on July 7th. And that was right around the time, again, of kind of Philando Castile, who, if you're not familiar with that story, was a victim of police brutality. Alton Sterling was another one. And then the police officer attack in Dallas, Texas. And we see that, again, just kind of like this massive spike. Trishana Cole tweeted 408 times that day. So this kind of like larger spikes as these kind of like wedge issues form. So what do we learn from all of this kind of background research? We learned a couple of things. There was a large amount of people hours involved in this to produce over 3,000 accounts. It must have taken a lot of work. They had a multi-million-dollar budget. There were thousands of accounts, kind of both user profiles and traditional news sources. Again, they propagated this information during peak times. And there were kind of these two distinct and opposing communities that they developed and spread disinformation and malinformation with. And that was kind of like the Blue Lives Matters community and the Black Lives Matters community. So again, going back to this concept of red teaming as an approach, the idea again is to kind of like build the most striking attack that we can develop in order to be able to develop a robust defense against it, right? That's what the kind of like idea of red teaming posits. So we want to develop an attack, and these kind of bullet points lead me to believe that a neural disinformation campaign would be a really striking attack moving forward. So what is neural disinformation, and why might we use it? Neural disinformation is essentially any type of disinformation that uses a neural network. We might be very familiar with some of these, kind of like developing fake news reports, fabricated video and audio. Many of you, I'm sure, are very familiar with kind of like the idea of deep fakes might be one of these attacks. Automated and hyper-personalized disinformation campaigns were used very widely by the IRA, and something that we might try to develop again instead of kind of like relying on Facebook algorithm. We might develop our own and do our own kind of research behind that as well. And then denial of information attacks are another attack that I think is extremely striking and very interesting, and something that is like kind of like highly overlooked. It's a kind of like large-scale bot-driven information generation campaign that is not necessarily pointed in its attack, but it's an attack to kind of like drown out information, right? So say there's like a large news story. Instead of kind of trying to persuade people with very pointed information, maybe we can drown out that information by doing a large-scale bot attack and just drowning it out with basic noise, right? There are a couple of real-life examples of this happening, and it's still like relatively unclear whether they use neural networks or some other approach. But if you're familiar at all with the US government opening up comments for the net neutrality bill that came up, we see that they received 22 million comments. Most of them contained overlapping or identical language. most of them use temporary or duplicate emails, and over 500,000 were from Russian addresses, right? So that we could venture to guess that they used some kind of automated system to be able to do this. It certainly wasn't a transformer because they weren't around at the time. LSTMs, potentially, maybe kind of like a Markov chain or something along those lines, or something much more simple and kind of like rudimentary than our approach that we're about to take. On the image side, this is kind of like a popular story that was out in the news. Katie Jones was a profile on LinkedIn. She claimed to be a Russia and Eurasia fellow at CSIS and studied at the University of Michigan in literature. No one could find a record of her work. Our image, taking a look at this image, it kind of has like the classic telltale signs of using GANs or a generative adversarial network to be able to develop this image. As pointed out by Raphael Satter on the left, you can kind of see the telltale signs, right? Kind of like cockeyed eyes, a smudged earring, et cetera. Things that GANs really struggle to render were very prominent in this. And the account vanished kind of like immediately after this news broke, right? And this was also confirmed by Hao Li, the director of Visions and Graphics Lab at USC's Institute for Creative Technologies, who also took a look at this and determined that it had a very high likelihood of being GAN generated. So we still want to develop our attack, right? And we have a couple of tools to do that. One of them is Grover, that was produced by Allen AI. It's a large transformer model. I'm sure we're all familiar with kind of like transformer models and natural language generation. And that was, again, produced by Allen AI in May of 2019. GPT-2, maybe a little bit more of an infamous one. Again, a large transformer model for natural language generation was put out in February of 2019. So we can think about like ways that we might be able to use those. There have been some research in the field of red teaming already that I do want to highlight. I thought this study was particularly interesting. The industrialization of terrorist propaganda. It was put out by the Middlebury Institute of International Studies at CTEC. And they used GPT-2 to develop long-form manifestos, right? So they took a database of manifestos, fed it through GPT-2, and used it to develop these kind of like fake manifestos, right? Again, using this language model to generate new information. Here's what they primed one with. Here's a right-wing extremist example. Analyses that twist the evidence to fit preordained conclusions, but lend a scientific air of ideologies, et cetera. And they use that to prime the example, and this was the output. The greatest danger facing the world today is Islamo-Nazism. Should Islam ever gain political power in Europe, it will launch a Holocaust on the population of Europe, similar to the Jews' G-gangsterism, which I don't think is a word, during the Soviet period, right? So not wrong, not particularly like off point in the development of this output, right? It reads pretty coherently as well. So for this case study, we could take a kind of like a short form organic text generation approach. And again, using that kind of like Twitter data that we already found. And maybe we'll develop like a minimum viable fake, right, on Twitter. And we can use GPT-2. We'll use a small 117 million parameter model and the medium 345 million parameter model to develop these. And again, because we're not developing kind of like long form content, we just need it to kind of like be good enough, right, for a minimum viable. We'll take the top 100 IRA kind of like black culture Twitter accounts and the top 100 IRA kind of like far-right Twitter accounts, and develop 2 different models and kind of like see how they work. We'll train with comments only, as opposed to kind of like more advanced methods. And there are plenty of more advanced methods, everything from kind of using conversational AI to driving kind of like the narrative with reinforcement learning. Because we're creating like 140 character tweets, none of that might not be necessary for what we're trying to do. And then we'll test a couple of like sampling methods to see how well we did. And again, this is an attack that could like be done by a lone actor, a single person, maybe like in his or her own bedroom. It would cost them, maybe like $20 of compute to do over like, maybe like 8 hours of training or so. So very, kind of doable as opposed to the kind of like large budget of the IRA, right? If we train one on GPT-2 using random sampling, we can see that it does, kind of okay, right? So we can read a couple of the tweets. Hillary Clinton's foreign policy wiretapping program was selectively monitored by the former DNC County Director. Glowed Up says so much to cry about. Hashtag Black Policing. Hashtag Melanin. @Cook Queen. Hashtag Guns at Work. So it doesn't really hit the spot. But the development of these, could be good enough, particularly for a kind of like denial of information campaign, right? If we were to use top K sampling rather than random sampling, we see it's a little bit more coherent. A few years ago, Jamaican Girls Show just said they all came in, white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Native American in a video, but it's a lie of theirs. Hashtag being blacks, finding black people who listen on. So it's getting relatively close. And again, maybe not pointed enough to change anyone's mind, but certainly enough for a denial of information attack. We can scale up the model and use a medium-sized model as well. So if we look at the top one, black people, if you're feeling disheartened, please reach out to us. We're always there for you. They're starting to get more coherent, right? And again, we're developing this attack, we're developing this approach so that we can defend against it and build robust defenses. So the top case sampling, again, we're just kind of like sorting by probability and then zeroing out all of the words that are past kind of like this kth token. So we'll do like a top K of say like 40 for this sampling method. If we look at ones on the right, again, I'd like to see more evidence of why Clinton deleted 35 emails, the most dangerous man in America, the one who would appoint radical Islam to his cabinet, the moderate Islamic in America, ... So again, the kind of the development of these is pretty striking. We should test our models as well to see how well they did. We can do this by fine-tuning Roberta, which is another large transformer model. And if we fine-tune Roberta across the kind of like Black Lives Matters tweets, we see that top K of 40, it's really accurate in kind of like classifying these, right? As opposed to kind of this random sampling, both across the 345 and smaller 117 million parameter models. If we do the same for right-wing tweets, again against Roberta as a defense, we see that top K, again, it hovers around like 92%. Random sampling, on the other hand, is around 67 to 72% across both models. And if we look at the literature, and this is a paper that was put out, Human and Automatic Detection of Generated Text. If we look at the literature, that falls kind of like right in line with our kind of like training for BERT, right? So for the top K, with no word conditioning, we find that it's at around 94%, which was pretty close. And we could develop this and kind of like push this research a little bit farther. And this is kind of some ongoing research that I would like to explore. Basically asking the question, are we more likely to believe machine-generated text if it fits our socio-political views? I would venture to guess yes. I want to see how well that stands. And of course, we could do this, maybe on MTurk or some other platform. And this is ongoing work that I have going on right now, kind of moving away. I'm kind of have both my feet in the humanities. So kind of like moving away from AI more into kind of like the social science humanities realm. Because it's dependent on prior social political leanings, and we have to kind of like take representative samples, et cetera. So what do we find? We find for our minimum viable fake that top K sampling is really good at fooling humans, but really bad at fooling a discriminator, right? Similarly, random sampling is really good at fooling a discriminator, but if we go ahead and kind of like read those tweets, or if we look at the literature, of course, it's really bad at fooling humans. So that's a positive, right, as far as text generation, defending against text generation is concerned. And that's a kind of like conundrum that we're stepping into. If we do top K sampling with some kind of priming or seeding, even like, like one word, that might be kind of like middle of the road as far as text generation is concerned. And we have developed models for both communities that are ready to operationalize. So in closing, I'll say a couple of things. Well, we explored an analysis of IRA and disinformation. We showed approaches for short-form language generation, for disinformation and denial of service attacks. We analyzed the output of the classification and confirmed discriminator accuracy across sampling methods. I want to say, and just tack on to the end of this lecture, that is going to take a considerate kind of cross-disciplinary approach. If you look at the approaches of the IRA, it was not just kind of like firmly in, certainly not firmly in kind of like the AI approach in any regards, and we can't just kind of like throw AI itself at it. We need artists, we need designers, we need AI researchers to collaborate on this issue. And we need to kind of like think outside of the box, right? And we also need to think kind of speculatively in what kind of like disinformation could happen in the far future. Maybe we use like open pose and pix-to-pix to develop, kind of like some kind of like fake newscast or something like that. Something that we haven't really like thought about before, or like something that would be hard to kind of develop just through AI alone. So I want to treat this as kind of like both a talk and a call to action, and I'll open it up to any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much for the presentation. I wanted to know if you thought a little bit about organizing red teams for, this is a versus, like GANs that are created to specifically fool us into thinking it's a real person, versus something like a computer-generated influencer, which is like, we all know it's not real, but it still has that power of influence. So how would a red team in those different scenarios, and how would we approach it, from the humanities, sociological perspective for those two approaches? Yeah.
So I obviously threw like a pretty, pointed and very political approach. I should say that, obviously red teaming is certainly not new. We're really like borrowing this idea from the InfoSec community, who has been, doing it since InfoSec was around. And they use it in both kind of like very kind of like pointed political or situations, but also kind of like kind of like more practical applications as well. So it doesn't need to like strictly be kind of like very pointed attacks. And I think if we think about it from kind of like I think you said like kind of like a humanities perspective, a lot of that came in on kind of like the research side. That's maybe like certainly like a talk for a different time. But looking at kind of like this deep history, in this example, looking at the kind of like deep history of dividing people kind of like along racial lines through the use of dis and malinformation. And I think that we need to like incorporate some of that expertise into red teaming as well. Not strictly technical, but look at it from a kind of like historical perspective as well. I think that can really inform us.
Thank you so much. Very intriguing. It's very scary. If you were access to some very, very large corporation, arbitrary amount of engineer, arbitrary amount of hardware data, any thoughts on how we can try to combat something like this more fundamentally or more substantially?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really depends. I'll say a couple of things. It would certainly really depend on the organization, what their product was, and who we were trying to defend against. And I left that kind of like vague in this example, right? So the blue team could have been like Twitter itself being attacked. Maybe the blue team is really kind of like Black Lives Matters, which is itself kind of like a formal nonprofit. So kind of like depending on the problem and depending on the kind of like product that team is developing, that'll really like kind of like shift in different directions, I think.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. So you briefly mentioned that you would get some feedback via human annotators on Amazon mTurk. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on like how you may approach something like that from more of a cognitive perspective? Sure.
Yeah, certainly. So my approach right now is, obviously first IRB approval, and then the rest of it is really polling like their political leanings, trying to do a wide enough poll of where they stand kind of like politically, socioeconomically, et cetera, to see what factors might sway those opinions. And then do a kind of like cross-sampling, having them look at maybe tweets from, if I were to use tweets from maybe like both different directions, and try to do some data analysis afterwards.